Hey, what's up? This is Factor from beatacademy.com. Now, this is the first video of a mini series that I'm putting together to help you get the most out of your stock plugins when using your DAW. Now, I'm primarily going to be using Ableton Live throughout this mini series, so I might be highlighting specific features about these stock plugins. But the principles can be used all across the board, no matter what DAW that you're using. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, I personally kind of categorize audio effects into four basic categories or four basic food groups. I have my first category, which deals with shaping the overall tone, and that's going to deal with EQs, filters, and things like that. The second category will mostly focus on the overall dynamics or the volume changes and things like that. So gates, compressors, they'll fit in that second category. Then I have my dimension category, which are things like delays, reverbs, choruses, because they're adding dimension and width to the sound. And then I have my color category, which are things like distortion, saturators, things like that that'll add different color and harmonics to that sound. And there's plenty other plugins that'll fall into any of those categories or maybe even blend between one or the other. But those are the four basic food groups. So in this video, we're going to focus on that first category, shaping the tone. Now, what I mean by shaping the tone, I mean that we're using a tool such as an equalizer to control the volume of a specific frequency within that sound. It's like when you take a photo and before you publish it on Instagram, you notice that there's not enough lighting in your photo. So you're going to use one of the tools there to brighten up that photo because there just wasn't enough light in that environment. Or if there was too much light, you're going to make the photo darker. And so with that picture in mind, no pun intended, I'm going to use the EQ to do exactly that. So in Ableton Live, we have an EQ8 and an EQ3. Let's start with the EQ8. I'm going to click, drag that onto our drum bus here. So just as I said, the equalizer, and I know it's pretty straightforward, but I'm going to assume that you've never seen one of these before in your life. And what we're dealing with here is the ability to control the volume of specific frequencies. So just by double clicking this area, we'll expand it and give us a larger view. And so when I hit play, you can see a spectrum analyzer in gray letting us know exactly the frequency response. So the sound that we're listening to, as you can see here, seems to be a little bit much heavier on the bottom end, meaning there's a lot more bass to it than there is on the top end here. Now, right off the bat, what's been helpful for me in using EQs effectively has been treating it as a seesaw. Now, if you're not familiar with the seesaw, the whole concept is you have two people, if someone's sitting on the bottom or it's a lot heavier, when they're down, the other person's up. And when this person's down, this person's up. So it's that seesaw effect. And so the way I've been using EQs effectively is thinking, I don't necessarily always have to, if I want more highs, I don't always necessarily have to boost high end. I don't have to pump up the frequency for the highs. I can get the same effect just by even taking away some lows, because when the lows are down, the highs are a lot more evident. Same thing in reverse. When there's less highs there, the lows seem to be more evident. So that concept has been really helpful for me to realize, hey, I don't really have to always boost more highs. I can just take some lows away, some of the bass away from something, and that will make the highs a little bit more in the forefront. Something to consider and keep in mind. But the way this EQ would work is that you can basically find a band. Since we have 8 frequency bands to choose from, we can click one and just kind of rotate anywhere into the frequency spectrum and just boost or cut. Now, another tool that can be really effective in learning how to manipulate your sound with an EQ is just become familiar with specific frequency spots. So one tool I like using here in this specific EQ, and if you don't have this tool available, you can just do the same thing by just raising or boosting specific frequencies, finding them and being familiar with them, and kind of memorizing. This is more towards ear training, just having your ears more familiar with what that frequency sounds like. Because we use terms like boxiness or boomy or brittle or bright, and you might not see those words described on your EQ. So when someone says it's too bright, too brittle, too boxy, you're like, I don't understand. So those frequencies respond to what tone or the actual quality of sound that it's giving to that audio. For instance, if we boost this frequency here, you get more of that boxy tone. You get as if this feels a little boxed in. So I would go through some of the frequency spectrums and I would just kind of commit that to memory. Oh, okay. So from 400 or from 400 to 600, that'll give me some of that boxy tone, or, just commit it. Call it however it is that whatever it feels like to you when you visualize it. But this tool here, this headphone tool, allows you to just solo a specific frequency band, and you can pinpoint exactly what that sounds like. Another thing is when you find those problematic frequencies, instead of just leaving them up there, you can then just go ahead and reduce that. And that eventually will help clean up anything that will kind of stick out and create good balance within the mix. So an EQ works in two ways. You're boosting, but then you have the actual shape of that band. And so in this EQ, we can determine how much area that we want to affect in our EQ. So what I mean by the area is, do I want to affect just this small area here? Or do I want to affect a broader area? Or do I want to be really specific and narrow and do surgical work? I was like, I'm just trying to find that one artifact in there that's really driving me crazy. Those can be chosen by the different types of bands. So your basic bands is what we call a bell. So you have a bell curve. So I'll set number 3 to a bell curve. And you can see here when we boost the volume, we have a nice little bell right here, boosting and reducing. Then you can choose by a high pass. This basically means that we're only letting the highs pass. So everything from here below is going to get cut away. So that's the highs. That's a high pass filter, or just a high pass band selection. And then you can have a shelf, basically saying from here on out, I want everything to be lifted. So I'm putting this frequency high up on a shelf. So from everything from this band upwards, let's put that on a shelf, right? So you can reduce or boost on the shelf. Then you have a notch. And this is basically opposite of a bell. Oh, it's just taking away, or scoop. It's just scooping away a specific frequency. And then you have everything going backwards. So you have a shelf, which is going up. So this is a high frequency shelf. And then you have a low pass, which is only letting the lows pass. Now, all this can be used to shape the overall tone. As I said, with the high end frequency gone, we're really going to get more of the bass tone. So that would be more of the kick drum and the bottom end of this. And essentially, as you might see, the EQ also doubles up as a filter, because that's essentially what you're doing, is you're filtering out things or frequencies that you don't want to be present for that audio. So you have those bands, but then you can determine how broad or how specific those bands are going to affect that frequency. And that's where we deal with our Q. Or in other EQs, you might see it as peak. So the Q determines how wide or how narrow you're focusing in with that specific band. So here we have band number 4. And the higher I raise my Q, you can see the more narrow it becomes. And the less of the Q, the more broad it becomes. So band number 4, just by adjusting that, is going to affect a larger area of this sound. So think of it, when to use a narrow Q. A narrow Q is really helpful when you're trying to just find specific things in that sound that are just really kind of poking out. And it's very what I call surgical work. It's like, let's go in there and find really problematic frequencies, either boost or take them away. So narrow cues will help you do exactly that. Broader cues are more for just a broad stroke. It's like, I could use some more bottom end or some more bass from the drums. So I'll just go ahead and maybe have a more broader cue so I can just beef up all the low end information that's coming in from here. Now, this particular EQ, we can have adapt cue on, and that's going to allow us to have an adaptive cue. So when I actually go higher, it will actually go, the cue itself will adapt. So it would get smaller. If I, let's say, narrow the EQ with the adapt cue on, watch what happens as we go lower. See, the cue actually gets thinned out and actually narrows itself out. Same thing as I boost that as well. So this is really helpful too. So the more higher you are in that frequency band, instead of bringing everybody else next to that band with it, it'll just get more narrow, more specific on the frequency that you want to boost. So it's really helpful as you're reducing and boosting gain to have the adaptive cue on, because then it'll just focus on that specific frequency as you do both the cutting and the boosting. Now, in particular, with this EQ, you can determine how the spectrum analyzer is being, or how it's performing. So here, the higher numbers will give you a more accurate count. The lower the number of the block just pretty much gives you a bulk reading of the spectrum analyzer. So I'm going to put a lot more. It's just the way I like to think of it is like pixels, right? So the more pixels you have, the better resolution that you're going to have with your photo. Same thing here with the spectrum analyzer within this specific plugin here for Ableton Live's EQ. The refresh rate also determines, the lower the refresh rate will determine how often does the spectrum analyzer refresh. So lower might take more CPU, but it'll give you more accurate results. And then your average here, the greater value that is, will give you more of the average volume. The less of that number is, you're focusing more on the peaks, like how quickly those volume changes happen from the frequency response. So if you've got something like maybe on a bus channel where there's several instruments in there, drums, loops, and all this, which is the case here, I have my drum bus on here, I will have the average set to maybe 8. That way I have a more overall average sound and not just focusing on the peaks. Also, you can determine what exactly is it that you're adjusting frequency wise. Now here we're affecting the stereo signal. So that means the signal that we're going to be hearing out of our left and right speakers together. But in here we can change the mode. Say, you know what, I want to affect the left speaker or the left source of that audio differently than I do the right. And this is really cool if you have things hard panned, left and right on a bus. So for instance, let's say we use this EQ on a bus channel, which means that you have several sounds routed to that channel. In this case, we have a drum rack and a drum loop. But let's say I'm panning one sound completely to the right, and then I'm going to pan the other sound completely to the left. Well, now we can focus in on equalizing specifically the signal on our left, because that's what we're editing right now. And we can adjust that bands as the way we seem fit. Then you click this to choose the right signal, and you still see the left signal curve there in gray, but then we can boost. And we can focus in adjusting the right signal there. And then you can also determine to not just affect the left and right, but the mid side. And this is different than the left and right, because then this gives you the ability to focus on what source of audio, what audio is coming in the middle. Just think of it as like what's being focused, all the energy that's being focused in the center. And then the side is all that information that's really pushed over to the stereo field. So Anything, I usually use mid-side EQing as a great way to add some stereo lift and to take away maybe any low end from things that are being panned hard left, right, maybe things like synthesizers or pads or things like that. So I'll go ahead and pan this right back to the center. But then you can use this mode to just tweak the frequency bands for your mid and side as well. You can also use the option here by right-clicking to copy what frequency band changes you have in your mid over to the side and the other way around. You can copy what information you've done to the side over to your mid. You can also change the quality of the oversampling in this EQ, specifically with Ableton Live's EQ8. Right-clicking this and choosing oversampling, you're actually getting better resolution out of the EQ. Might take a little bit more of the CPU resources, but it does improve the quality coming out. Next, you can also choose the different types of scale. So let's say let's go back to stereo here. Let's say we're doing some pretty dramatic EQing. Well, let's say I don't want to fully commit 100% to the way that I'm EQing that. So you can scale it back down, and you can also flip it in reverse. So say I just want that to be minute, just a little bit of that. But at 100%, as you can see, or 200%, you can see it's really drastic. This is also a cool thing to do and to automate as well. You can click this and automate so that it's actually changing the tone of that sound and going back and forth. This is a really cool thing. And then you have your overall gain. That means the output of all the bands that have been boosted and cut joined together. And that's just the output of the EQ itself. Well, I hope this video has been helpful for you in how to use the EQ to shape the overall tone of the audio that you're using in your projects. This is the first part of this mini series. So next we're going to focus in on the second category, which is the overall dynamics, using compression, gates, and things like that. And my gift to you for watching this video and for staying on board for this long is I want to send you a sample pack loaded with some sounds, loops, construction kits, one-shots, and transition effects that you can use in your projects right away. They're 100% royalty free, so you can use them in your projects and share that music with the rest of the world. And it works on any DAW that you're currently using. Just simply click, drag, and drop into your projects and start being inspired. So you can access this sample pack absolutely for free just by clicking the link below in the description box. Or you can visit www.beatacademy.com/pack and download your sample pack today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.